Hello my peeps, this Algebra Nation video will cover workbook page 129, problem square root 25.
What we have to do is write a completely factored expression equivalent to the following expression. We're given the expression negative 12n squared plus 81n plus 21. Now, what we have to ask ourselves is, okay, in this polynomial, we have three different terms. Now, in those three different terms, do they share any factors? That should be our first question we ask ourselves. Well, they don't share a variable because even though these first two terms have an n in them, this is just a constant. 21 is just a constant and does not have an n, so they do not share an n. Well, what about any other number for the coefficients? We have 12, 81, and 21. What we can recognize, hopefully, is that, well, they don't share 2 as a factor, but do they share 3? Well, we can go through and we see, yes, they do share 3 as a factor. We can check each one of them and realize that they do share 3. So what we can do is pull out a 3. Okay? And what I'm going to do is actually pull out a negative 3 because I don't like my first term, my n squared term, or just my squared term in general, to be negative whenever I'm working problems like this. So I'm going to factor out a negative 3. How do I do that? Well, it's like I'm dividing each one of my terms by a negative 3. It's really all that I'm doing. So I'm taking negative 12n squared. So I'm just going to take negative 12 divided by negative 3, and I get 4. Remember, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. This is going to be 4n squared. Cannot forget my variable. Okay? So a very common mistake, people will forget their variables, but you cannot do that. You can't just divide 12 by 3 and forget that there's an n squared there as well. So then we take 81 divided by that negative 3, and we get negative 27. That's going to be negative 27, but again, I have an n right there. Now I'm going to take 21 divided by that negative 3 since I'm factoring out. It's like the opposite of distributing. And I'm going to take 21 divided by negative 3, and I get negative 7. I'm just checking myself on my calculator. You do not have to use your calculator if you don't want to, but it's a nice little check that I like to do sometimes. So then now I've got negative 3 on the outside of my parentheses, and I've got a polynomial term on the inside. So I'm going to take a look at this polynomial term and ask myself if it can be factored. Well, here's a little test. What I'm going to do is multiply my first term and my last term, 4 and negative 7, the coefficients on those two, and I get negative 28. Well, once I have negative 28, I'm trying to do a little bit of magic, and I'm trying to figure out two numbers that multiply to be negative 28 and add to be my middle term. So multiply to be negative 28, add to be my middle term. Well, what I'm going to write out are a couple of pairs of factors of negative 28. I'm going to write out 28 and 1, then ask myself, if I added up those two, could I get negative 27? Well, 28 plus 1 is 29, but remember, I'm trying to multiply to be negative 28. So one of these two is going to have to be a negative. So let me see if I have negative 28 times 1 is, yes, negative 28. So I multiplied them, I got that negative 28. What if I add them? Negative 28 plus 1 is indeed negative 27. So I found my two numbers. I know that I have negative 28 and I have a 1. Well, what I'm going to do is actually rewrite the inside of my parentheses. But then now, instead of writing negative 27n, I'm going to split it up. Okay, we're going to factor by grouping. I'm going to split that up. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to have 4n squared. I'm going to split this negative 27 up into negative 28n and 1n. So I've got minus 28n, and I've got plus 1n. And all I did was change that plus negative 7 to a minus 7. I'm allowed to do that. Adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting. So then now, I'm going to...
Are you allowed to take a brain break? Absolutely. Let's see what today's brain break holds for us. Oh, instead of King James, it should be King Crybaby. Wah! Wah! He fouled me. Wah! Epic fail. One of the problems of our society today, no one wants to take accountability or responsibility for their actions. So King Crybaby, take accountability and responsible for your actions. You missed the shot. Back to work.
Factor by grouping. Don't forget my negative 3 that's out in front. I'm going to factor by grouping and say, okay, my first two terms, I've got 4n squared minus 28n. My second two terms, I've got n minus 7. Okay, we're going to take each one of those pairs and say, okay, do 4n squared and negative 28n, do they share any factors? Well, I can hopefully realize that 4 will go into 4, and 4 will go into negative 28. So from rewriting this, I'm asking myself, what do they share? Well, they at least share a 4, but then do they share an n as well? Yes, so they also share 1n. So then now, once I do that, I say, okay, they share that 4n. Okay, can't forget about that negative 3 out in front. They share this 4n, but what happens when I factor out that 4n? Well, all that I'm left with in my first term is just 1n. And if I take 28 divided by 4, just as a double check, I can take 28 divided by 4 equals 7. But remember, it was minus 28, so a negative divided by that positive is going to be negative 7. Okay, so I divided this by 4n because I factored it out. And then over on this other side, I've got plus n minus 7. So then now what I have to realize is that, okay, in this first grouping, this first pairing that I did, I got an n plus 7, or n minus 7 as one of my factors. On the second grouping, I got n minus 7 as one of my factors. What did I have to factor out to get this n minus 7? This is a little bit tricky. We didn't factor out anything, so it's almost like I have a 1 out in front. All right, so I've factored by grouping. One last step is take my negative 3 that's still on the outside. But then on the inside now, I know that I have my paired up n minus 7. So I'm going to write that one first. But then I'm going to multiply that by my other two, 4n plus 1. So I've got 4n plus 1. And then that is my completely factored form. And I'm good to go. So really in this last step right here, all that I did is I took n minus 7. And I factored it out of these two multiplied terms. Okay?